Hey everybody, welcome to my second video in my JavaScript 101 course. And now we're going to go on to the next step, which is variables. So bottom line, right now you could console anything in this. So if I wanted the console log 2 plus 2, then what would happen? I save it, and I refresh, and 4, it consoles 4. Problem is, like, there's only so much I can do with that. And in the future, a lot of times your program is going to have a lot of things that it just doesn't know yet. Okay, it won't know what kind of information the user is going to give it, or what kind of information will come down the pipeline in your program. So you need to be able to store pieces of information in kind of little cubby holes where you can call upon them whenever you want, and that's called a variable. Now there are three ways to call a variable: var, let, and const. All of these prefixes will let you create a variable. Now, var is sort of the oldest way of doing it, and it's kind of become sort of the antiquated way of doing it. People don't really use var anymore. But let's talk a little bit about var. If I were to create a variable using var, meaning variable, let's say variable, we'll just say a number, so a num. And typically when you name your variables, you use what's called camel casing, which means generally the first word is in lowercase, and then every other word, the first letter is capitalized. So a num for a number. And you generally always want to have semantic variable names, meaning variable names that describe what the number represents. So that way when other programmers read your code, they know what's going on. Okay, you're saying A or I doesn't really tell anybody anything. So I've created a variable called a num, and it's going to equal 5. Cool. So now I want to show in the console, console.log, a num. Save. Okay, and then refresh. And there we go. So first it consoles the 2 plus 2 over here, the first line, and then it consoles a num, which is 5. Cool. Now notice how JavaScript reads that. It read it line by line. Everything happens in order. So watch what happens if I did this. So if I were to take this console log and instead move it before we actually assign the value of 5 to a num, it's going to cause an error because we're going to be trying to print a variable before we've actually gave it a value. So C now shows undefined because at the point, so first it consoled the 2 plus 2, 4, then it consoled a num, which doesn't have a value yet, and then we gave it a value, so it was too late. But now, if I were to go into the console and say, hey, what's the value of a num, by just typing in a num, it'll tell me 5. So basically, the cool thing about the console is that you can interact with your program that has already run. All the variables that you've created in your program are still there. You can still play with them. So I can be like a num plus 5 equals 10. And again, this just helps you debug. So you can kind of figure out what went wrong with different parts of your code by trying to see, okay, what's this variable worth after my code is run? To see where the things I didn't mean for it to happen happened. And that's generally how people use console logs. What happens is their program gets more and more complicated. They keep console logging variables, so that way as their program runs, they can kind of see how the variables are, but in a way that the person who's looking at the website wouldn't notice unless they were the developer looking for it. Cool. So that's that. So that's var. And the thing is, I could change the value. So let me put the console log back down here. And I'm going to actually, we're going to reassign. And again, one equal sign means assignment. So basically, when I say a num equals 7, what I'm saying is that there's this bucket called a num, and I'm going to put the number 7 inside of it. Okay, so anytime now a num gets called going forward, there's a 7, it actually overrides the 5. The 5 is no longer there. So now watch what happens when I run the code. Cool. And notice I didn't put var again. You only have to put var, const, or let if the variable hasn't been declared yet. So you have the first time you use a variable, you put var, let, or num. And then here, if I use let, it'll work the same way. There is a difference between let and var, but not one that should really be really matter too much in most of today's programming. The basic difference is something called scope, which I'll get into in a little bit. Now, if I use const, that means that that variable is a constant, which means you cannot reassign the variable. I cannot redo it. In this case, it's going to throw me an error because I'm going to first assign 5 to a num, which I declared as a constant, but then try to reassign a 7. So let's watch what happens. See, assignment to a constant variable can't do it. So that's another cool thing about looking at your terminal. It tells you errors, and you can kind of see the errors on line 7. So line 7 in my code, that's where I assigned the 7. So I can go be like, okay, something's wrong with this piece of code, and I can assess it from there. So that's what const let do. Okay, so const is const. Now, what's the difference between var and const? There's something called scope. Okay, we don't know what a function is yet. But let's say I make a, let's say we talk about, I create a quick function. Don't worry about what we're doing here. I'll explain this again and again later. So const a function equals okay, and then here I said let a num equal 5. Okay, so these two curly brackets represent what the function does. Okay, what a function is, don't worry about it right now, but it represents what's in the function. So you have to treat this kind of like a separate sub-container. So there's your program, which contains a bunch of variables, but then your functions are like little sub-containers that have their own variables that cannot be accessed outside of the function. So there's global scope, so that's any variable that I declare outside of the curly braces of the function. It can be called anywhere. So let's say I created another one. Let body equal 10. And I'm going to console log that over here. Okay, and I'm going to try to console log a num over here outside of the function. Now here's the thing about a function. This code here isn't actually going to run. I'm only defining how it functions. So for me to use that function, I have to actually call it. So I'm going to say, hey, a func. Okay, so let's run that code. Save. Okay, so basically what happened here is that first we console logged the 4. Then we console logged, well, first we assigned the variable let body 10. We define a function here, and then I run that function. So here I run the function, and when that function runs, it console logs body. Cool. And again, body has global scope because it's not in the function, so it's able to show up here on the screen. But let a num, even though I created let a num within the function, once the function is done, it doesn't exist anymore. I can't call it from outside of the function. So if I were to add another one of these inside the function, let's see the difference. Okay, so let me refresh. So in this case, it was able to console log a num, which is 5, inside. So here again, that's matching up with line 9 of the code when it's in the function, but it can't do it when it's outside of the function. That's called scope. So you have to be careful where you declare variables and when you call them. Generally, it's the best habit possible is to keep as many variables as possible within your functions and give them local scope. It just avoids less confusion, because what happens is people lose track of their global variables, and then they get changed in 4 or 5 different functions, and people can't figure out which function caused the number to be what. So the less global variables you have, and the more your functions work strictly with variables within the function, the better. So that's a quick crash course on variables. I'll see you guys in the next course.